Um, well, it's taken us quite some time, if you remember the beginning of this study, to get to where we are today. And some of you might be interested to learn, we have finally made it to a little bit beyond, actually, the halfway point in this story. Although some of you probably inside are groaning that there's still half a book left for me to go through. But one of the challenges in taking on such a large book, in my opinion, as I prepare these messages, is kind of dealing with how week to week it's presented. In a sense, I feel almost like I'm writing a TV sitcom where I need to have enough of the story, enough of the themes continuing week to week to keep those who have been along the study with us for quite some time to stay interested and stay involved. But also, it should be kind of simple enough to where people can jump in and not feel lost. And so I figured that, I really don't need any help making people feel lost, if you've heard me ramble up here before, but I decided I should probably do a brief recap of things that have transpired up to this point to bring us up to speed. It's been some time since we left chapter 15 in our last study. So I want to begin by laying out the reality that although we have witnessed Israel coming up came up against from their enemies outside of their own borders, that really now the enemy is within their own borders, that the greatest threat lies within their own government. In the last few chapters of 1 Samuel, I've really exposed to us the type of king that Saul would be, mostly confirming now that Saul would be the king exactly as the Lord said he would be, that he would rule harshly and he would take from the people. And Saul began as a humble young man, one who was thrust into the role of Israel's first king in the monarchy, but quickly that veil of humility was lifted to expose a man with very little spiritual depth. And as such, with a little bit of power, he grew into a prideful authoritarian. And now, despite moments of promise, wherein he led great military campaigns at the guidance of the Lord, Saul's spiritual ignorance led him to many irresponsible decisions. He offered a sacrifice before the appointed hour when Samuel would arrive. He hesitated and failed to appropriately deal with the Philistines on multiple occasions. He made irrational vows at the expense of his own people. And finally, all this culminated in chapter 15, where Saul disobeys the command of the Lord in defeating the Amalekites fully. And that last failure, as we noticed, would be his undoing. The Lord, speaking through his prophet Samuel, rejects Saul from being king of Israel. And the chapter ends with these solemn words, "But Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king." And so we pick up in chapter 16 after these events, and we're going to read the first 13 verses, but we're only going to go walk through the first 7 verses today, and we'll finish the rest next week. So beginning in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 1. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." And the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, 'I have come to sacrifice to the Lord,' and invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. And you shall anoint for me him whom I declare to you." Samuel did what the Lord commanded and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the city came to meet him, trembling, and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." And come with me to the sacrifice. And he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they came, he looked on Eliab and thought, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man sees on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." And Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." Then Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all your sons here?" And he said, "There remains yet the youngest, but behold, he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and get him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." And he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy and had beautiful eyes and was handsome. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." And Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. And Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Now many people come to the Scriptures, and particularly the Old Testament, and they have doubts as to its relevance to their lives today. It's as if many Christians have forgotten the historic convictions of the church that the Bible is living and active. It is sharper than any two-edged sword. That it was written for our instruction here today and every day. It's no wonder that we see generations of Christians look upon the world around them and conclude, well, this is just terrible. It's never been this bad to be a Christian. And those who aren't in this same mode of complete despair are at the very least left with a very difficult question. How do we make sense of this all? I mean, in this world, one morning we wake up and we discover that the next president of the United States is a billionaire businessman with no political experience, who is more famous for his TV shows and his high-profile marriages and divorces. How do we make sense of that? And then 4 years later, we wake up, and when we think that man's going to get reelected, we find that we have elected a man who hardly knew he was running for president half the time, and whose liberal ideology is the most radical we've ever seen in the White House. Now we're really wondering, how do we make sense of that? And the sad reality is that far too many Christians have turned to reasoning by way of conspiracy, by way of hatred, by way of fear. They're calling for boycotts and investigations and trying really hard to slander anyone with opposing political views. And if I could put it this way, too many professing Christians believe that this has happened as a result of corrupt people, and our only hope for fixing it is by electing other people. And their faith is only seems to get involved when they're just offended by the other people. And then they can use their faith as a tool for argumentation. Never mind that their candidate themselves lives a very contrary lifestyle. And I've heard Christians say that Trump is God's choice and Biden he's Satan's choice, and we need to make sure that we put the right man back in the White House. And this way of thinking is why we so desperately need the Scriptures, the full counsel of God. And the passage we have before us today is not only important for how we understand the situation in 1 Samuel in 1050 BC, but for how we understand, as John Woodhouse puts it in his commentary, everything, all of life, all of creation on earth and in the universe. And it should give us great hope, not this abject despair that we seem to find in the church today over the dealings of men. It's a common enough phrase to hear in churches and in Christian circles that, God is in control. And that's true, but you'll find very few who actually believe it. So they get confused, and their confusion turns to hopelessness, and it turns to anger, and it turns to bitterness. But for the true Christian, the sovereignty of God does not negate mourning over the seeming prevailing of the wicked, but our mourning leads us somewhere. This is why, as Pastor Jared pointed out last week, our lament is a grace of God, really. That it makes us acutely aware of the reality of fallen man, but ultimately, it brings us to the cross. to the one who will one day wipe away every tear, to the one whose peace surpasses all understanding. In a sense, this is what we find the Lord reminding Samuel of as we open chapter 16. And it's important for us to understand what is going on here, because this isn't just a continuation of the events of chapter 15. It's not stated, but there is, as we can see by the context, some time has passed since the events of chapter 15, since Samuel had slayed Agag and the Lord rejected Saul. And we open to find Samuel is still grieving over these events. And as we're about to find out, God calls Samuel to action out of this grief, but the lapse in time between the rejection of Saul and the Lord's calling of Samuel to action tells us, if anything, that Samuel's grief was allowed by God for a time. And not only that, but the Lord found it necessary that the anointing of a new king after the rejection of the old one, for the advancement of the nation now, would be put on hold while Samuel grieves. I thought to myself, isn't that something? That the Lord of the universe understands our human existence and that it's not an easy one. He doesn't stand over us in his infinite perfection and just say, you humans are so weak, just snap out of it. Although he perfectly well could. But no, he allows us to grieve. I like to imagine that at the rejection of Saul, the Lord looked upon Samuel and he knew his anguish, and he had compassion on him because he knew exactly what it would be like for a king to be rejected. He knew in his foresight that he himself would be coming to earth one day, adorned in human flesh, and would experience exactly what is going on in Israel now: oppression, being downtrodden, being weak. Samuel he's not just crying over spilled milk here. Samuel's entire life was revolving around this restoration of God's glory in Israel through its leadership. The establishment of the monarchy was, we can say, the seminal moment in Samuel's life. You don't think there were moments in Samuel's life growing up where he was probably thinking, I wonder what it would just be like to be a normal boy, to live with mom and dad, to play with my brothers and sisters, and to have less to carry about. He would never know a life like that. He was in the temple since he could walk. Eli raised him. All of his life was dedicated to the Lord and his purposes. And now, the grand culmination of that life, it's all lost. The kingship is over before it even really started. And Samuel knew exactly what this rejection meant for Saul and for the people that he so deeply cared about. But for as warranted as his mourning may be, it is apparent also by the words of God that, as the writer of Ecclesiastes says, there is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the sun. And that certainly includes our grief. The rejection of Saul is real, but it wasn't everything. And Samuel undoubtedly prayed and maintained his worship practices in his grief, but he allowed his sorrow to overwhelm him. So the Lord reminds him, if you will, of just exactly what is going on here. He says, I have rejected him. Don't forget that. I'm not surprised by this, Samuel. It's not that this wasn't something I wasn't expecting to do. You should know my work is not going to be paralyzed by the efforts of one man. So he gives him a very clear command. Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king. Samuel may remember some time ago when God told him at the beckoning of the people of Israel, appoint for them a king. And now Samuel should be renewed, in a sense, to hear, for myself a king. All is not lost after all. But as exciting as this is, there is still one hang up for Samuel. Saul is still the king. He can't very well run around with a horn of oil just anointing people, especially when the road to Bethlehem runs right through Saul's hometown of Gibeah. And you might ask yourself, as I kind of did when I read this, does he really need to fear Saul that much, that he would kill him? I mean, he's up to this point, he's been kind of volatile and wishy-washy, if you will, but hasn't necessarily been outright violent. But perhaps Samuel knows more about Saul than we do. And maybe the fracturing of their relationship at the end of chapter 15 had an impact that we aren't aware of. Samuel's concerns here will be certainly confirmed in later chapters, but now we just see him as hesitant here. So the Lord offers Samuel a way of concealment. Say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. And this is an interesting verse. We have to set out from the outright here that it is not a lie. There are some who believe that God is condoning deception here and for Samuel to lie, but he's not. Of course, we know that he will go and sacrifice to the Lord at Bethlehem. But rather, what is happening here, he's not trying to trick Saul into believing that something is going to happen that is not, but rather he is just withholding the full truth so that Saul would not intervene. But I find it strange still that Saul wouldn't be at least curious as to why Samuel would be going to Bethlehem to offer sacrifice. It is out of the ordinary here, because we understand that the circuit of Samuel throughout the year to go and do his sacrifices throughout the nation would not go through small towns like this. But once again, as you may remember from many previous weeks, we've sought to establish that Saul's spiritual ignorance has led to much of his disastrous decisions. And this is really no different. Saul never paid much attention to the spiritual matters of the country. He didn't even know Samuel's name prior to his anointing, if you remember back in chapter 9. So we can't really expect him to understand that Bethlehem was not on this yearly circuit, and that Samuel's visiting to such a town would not really be typical of a prophet, unless there was some significant business to handle. Now, whether Saul actually takes notice of anything or not, we aren't told. We don't know. All we know is that Samuel did what Saul had failed to do. He obeyed the Lord. And he arrived in Bethlehem as commanded. But then another strange thing takes place, and it doesn't really catch Samuel by surprise, seemingly, but it certainly caught me by surprise. The elders come to meet him trembling. This old man Samuel, this prophet of God, why tremble? Well, they certainly knew what we had just mentioned, that Samuel doesn't typically come to small towns like Bethlehem. That something has to be seriously going on here. Or maybe they saw the instability of the nation and thought it could be a foreshadowing for some terrible judgment coming down from the prophet. I suppose it really doesn't matter what their reasoning was, because whatever their fears are seem to be abated by Samuel's response to them asking if he comes peaceably. They could still be wondering why he's there to sacrifice, but they don't ask. Maybe they figure it's just better to not know. They're just happy he comes in peace. And so the scene is set now. Jesse and his sons are consecrated to come to the sacrifice. And I wonder if as they're approaching, Samuel had some sort of excitement that you could see on his face. Here comes Jesse, the grandson of Ruth and Boaz, and following behind him are 7 or 8 of his sons. And in the front of that line is very visibly to Samuel the next king of Israel, a tall, good-looking young man named Eliab. And Saul says to himself, surely this is the Lord's anointed. He saw before himself a young man who you just looked upon him and you knew he was strong, you knew he was capable, you knew he was confident. And that's what Israel needs right now, a confident, capable young man, because Saul is proving, if anything, to not be very capable or confident. But the Lord is quick to respond to Samuel's thoughts, saying, do not look on his outward appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. And it's interesting, that sentence could be applied to the current king as well. God once again has to remind Samuel of something that he should have already known, That he is not looking for someone who could be on the cover of GQ magazine or who could hold their own in a fist fight. This is about his glory. The Lord sees not as man sees, for man sees according to the eyes, but the Lord sees according to his heart. And that's the more literal translation from the Hebrew. And it seems to say much more about verse 7 than we think. You see, the pop Christian loves for this to mean that God can see our hearts and knows what's truly inside of us, but man only looks at actions and appearances, and that's absolutely true. But when God looks inside of a person, when he sees their heart, any person who has ever lived, what does he see? He sees evil. He sees wickedness. But so many want this verse to be used as a safeguard against judgment, so that they could say things like, you can't judge me, only God knows my heart. If the perfectly just God of the universe looks on our hearts to determine how he's going to use us, we might as well give up right now. As Paul Washer once mentioned in a sermon that I heard, he says, if I put a DVD on the screen in front of the congregation today of every one of your thoughts over the last 15 minutes, we wouldn't be able to turn our heads fast enough to see you running out of the building. And that's true, isn't it? Our thoughts are wicked, even believers. Certainly, God cannot determine the worthiness based on our hearts. It's foolish to think that, even with the best of us. But so many relinquish this verse to mean just that. God looked on Eliab's heart, and it was more wicked than David's, so he chose David, not Eliab, because David's heart was more godly. But at some point, we have to ask ourselves this question. If we believe that God is omniscient, why would he need to see a man's heart in order to validate him for his purposes? Eliab was not rejected because he didn't read his Bible enough. He was not rejected because his prayer life was not quite up to par. He was rejected because God, in his infinite, immutable, sovereign will from the beginning of time, did not intend to make him king. He saw him according to his own will and purpose. And in that will and purpose, there was another brother who would be the king. A brother not chosen because of what is in his heart, but because he was in God's heart. And this has tremendous implications for us today. This is how we answer that question, how do I make sense of all this? Because our point of view is limited, and our world is full of varying points of view because of that. We see with our eyes. We take in impressions. We process it, and we come to a conclusion based on our feelings, based on our experiences and our desires. Why do you think there are people who love Trump and who hate him? People who love Biden and who hate him? We see them with our eyes. And we can only come to conclusions based on our limited understanding of the world. So people go through great anxiety and vexation over the leadership of the country, while others experience satisfaction over the leadership. We literally cannot make sense of all of this in our understanding. But God is not limited. He does not have to take in impressions and interpret them. His gracious, sovereign purposes are the foundation for which everything in this universe happens. Everything. The end has already been written, and he has before himself the beginning, the middle, and end, and it is all worked out for his everlasting glory. And that is why Eliab is rejected. It's why David is chosen, not because of themselves, but because of the wisdom of God's infinite counsel. And I'll leave us with this from Isaiah 55. which I believe is very helpful for us in understanding this concept. It reads, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain and snow come down from the heaven, and do not return there, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower, and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes out from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I purpose, and shall succeed in the thing for which I sent it." Let's pray.